About noon, we struck some people. All the girls here wear nothing from the waist up and look most alluring. You can walk all day in New Guinea and, in the afternoon, see no distance away the place you left in the morning. The plane just arrived to pick me up. Was about to land when 3 Japanese made a surprise attack. Aircraft got full of holes. Had the tip of my finger grazed. Providence surely guided and protected me all through. Tons and tons of love, sweetheart, from your ever-loving husband, John.
What was the reaction when you heard that he was alive?
Well, we were most pleased, most pleased. The squadron was back again to what it was previously. We were sort of leaderless after he had not returned.
What was he like that evening? Did you see him?
Oh, yes, no, he was all right. I think breathing fire. I don't think he took very kindly to that at all.
He wanted to get back in the air?
Oh, well, how am I to know? If I were here, I wouldn't have wanted to get back, I don't think, very much at all, the wife and family, but I mean, he was back. He was determined to go back.
The condition that he was in, though, after 14 days through the jungle, he should never have flown again.
Well, he didn't front up at my tent to ask me whether he was fit, so I had no say in the matter. But I think his determination was such that there was no way of stopping him.
Jackson made light of his epic journey and the dramatic landing at 7 Mile, but the strain must have been immense. The joy the squadron felt as they crowded round their commanding officer was short-lived. Just 3 days after John Jackson's return, it said, the squadron was criticised by a couple of RAAF top brass. They told Jackson that his hit and dive tactics, which had saved the lives of so many of his pilots when fighting the more manoeuvrable Zeros, were in fact cowardly. They said the Kittyhawk pilot should stand and dogfight the Zero. Against his better judgment, John Jackson decided to follow the orders of his stupid superior officers.
I don't think there's any doubt that that was going on from the words that I heard, and he did what all of us had swore we wouldn't do because we knew we couldn't do and live, because a Zero can eat you up, and he did it.
The Australians found that we Japanese in our Zeros were good at dogfights. The pilots must have decided that they won't be caught the second time with the same tactics. They thought, aha, we have a better advantage when we dive in. So, in their next attack, they came from a high altitude, diving right in. We lost a lot of planes that way because they used that tactic.
We could not mix it with the Zero. The Zero turned on 5-cent piece, 6pence. We couldn't do that.
He'd have had to have gone soft in the head during the period of his tramping back to decide to dogfight Zeros. So this gives weight to my story that he said that the wing commanders were displeased with us. In fact, he said they had nominated us a bunch of dingoes.
What did that mean, to be called a dingo?
Well, cowards.
He had been told by higher authority that we were not doing the job we should be doing. And the pressure was on him to show what should be done. The whole thing was erroneous, of course. These men had high rank, but they'd never fought the Japs.
The next morning brought word that an enemy force of 8 bombers and 14 fighters was on its way over. The squadron was now down to 5 Kittyhawks, but odds of 4 to 1 against them had never bothered the Australian airmen. Unhesitatingly, John Jackson scrambled his men and climbed steeply to intercept.
I remember the detail of that occasion very well. We raced for our aeroplanes, doing up our throat mics as we went. And John's aeroplane was closest to the operations tent. Although he left last, he got there first. And he shouted out to all of us as we ran out to our aeroplanes. We'll fly in a V formation. Masters, you're my number 2. And then he was into his aeroplane. And as always with Jackson, once his motor started, he was off. So we went in on the bombers, and I was on my maximum climb and maximum, almost at a dead stop, with everything on, pointing at the sky, and when I fired the guns. When I fired the guns, all hell broke loose, and the aeroplane went into a spin, but I had seen some holes in the fuselage as I fired. I looked back when I got out of that through a break in the clouds and could see in the distance a fight was going on, and then heard John with all the epithets as usual, and knew that he was having a hell of a good fight of it. He was shouting in epithets that don't bear repeating, about why he couldn't get into this fella and why he couldn't do that, and I've got no doubt that others were on him too at the time.
That, you heard his last words, it would seem.
Yes, yes, as it turns out, those were the last words.
There seems little doubt that John Jackson died trying to confound the squadron's critics. It cost him his life to prove them wrong. The terrible job of breaking the news to his brother fell to Bill Dean Butcher.
Les Jackson was in hospital in Port Moresby with gastroenteritis. So I drove him in to tell him. I said that 2 pilots hadn't returned. One was John and one was Barry Cox. And he immediately came out, and we got set off in this small truck to find one of the crashes which had been located. But on the way, we met an army vehicle coming towards us and asked whether they knew where the crash was, and they said they had already located it, that the remains of the pilot had been taken from the accident.
They went up the mountain, and they found a boot with a foot in it, and that was rather large size, 10 or 12 or something or other. So that must be John, because he was a big man, and Barry Cox was the other man who didn't come back, and he was a small man, so it must have been. So Les Jackson identified a foot as being his brother. That must, so he was dead.
What did he do then?
I don't think he said much. We just drove back, and he assumed temporary command and carried on.
This is Mount Lawes, the place where John F. Jackson fell to earth. His plane hit with such an impact that its engine was found embedded 6 feet into the mountainside. The impact of his loss upon the squadron was just as devastating.
Well, we were depressed, of course. Almost as though the battle was lost, I guess.
But on the other hand, lurking in the back of the mind was, well, he bought it because he did something he knew he couldn't do. He tried to do something he knew it wouldn't work.
We thought it was very unfortunate. It could have been ourselves. And so it was an acceptable thing that he'd got the chop. We could have done the same.
John was an amazing man. He, as I told you, he joined us at Canberra, and for some reason we immediately took a liking to each other. He was much older than I, but he was just a born leader.
He was trying so hard, and he was so good, that he became a real figurehead. In fact, I don't think his value was appreciated until he was no longer there. But he sustained the morale under a desperate period, and people didn't know what to do. They had no idea of the circumstances around them. They just trusted John Jackson.
Yes, in all respects, a man of great willpower, strength of command, diligence, and bravery.
John Jackson's grave is now here at Bamana Military Cemetery, a few miles outside Port Moresby. He lies with the thousands of young Australians who were killed in the New Guinea campaign, their memorials patiently tended by people who, ironically, had no real stake in the war. There are other members of 75 Squadron here too, ground crew and pilots, buried directly beneath the skies they defended so desperately. A week after John Jackson's death, his brother Les was appointed in his place as commander of 75 Squadron. Les was a brilliant pilot, but in all other respects, he was nothing like his older brother. Fond of a drink, flamboyant, wild, Les slouched about in a cowboy hat with a .38 revolver, not quite the model Air Force officer. But within an hour of his appointment, Les Jackson had to face the fearful news that a huge Japanese invasion fleet was steaming towards Port Moresby. It was the 5th of May, and the squadron was down to its last 3 Kittyhawks. Les Jackson called all his pilots together.
It was late afternoon. Les sent messages that he wanted to see all pilots. They were standing in this tent, and he told them of the situation. The fleet's approaching. We must get everybody out. We have 3 airplanes, and we're going to attack.
But to get those 3 airplanes out, he wanted volunteers. So he called at the little gathering where he told us these things, called for volunteers, and the whole squadron of pilots stepped forward as volunteers.
Even though the alternative was to go home and
yes,
back to your loved ones and family, friends, and refreshments.
Yes.
All pilots stepped forward. He said, in that case, I'll have to make a decision. From memory, I think he selected 1 or 2 pilots who'd already done enough and said, you're not eligible.
Jackson said, Les Jackson said, you and you will not stay behind. You've done too much already. We're going to draw lots. So we drew, they broke some straws, and we drew, and Mick Butler and I drew the short straws.
Well, lucky me. I don't know what he drew, but it sticks or what, but I drew one. Peter Masters drew one.
And Les didn't put his name in.
That was all there was. Masters, myself, and Les.
Mm.
Les said, well, I've got the other aeroplane. So that made the 3 pilots they wanted, and we stayed behind.
How did you feel as you saw this dramatic scene in which every single pilot volunteered to...
It was very moving.
Volunteered to fly the remaining Kittyhawks against the Japanese invasion fleet.
Yes, it would have been a suicide mission, I've no doubt.
The next day, as Jackson, Masters and Butler readied their planes for that last hopeless mission, a daring Zero attack damaged 2 of the Kittyhawks on the ground. Les Jackson jumped into the last serviceable fighter and flew it towards the invasion fleet. Fortunately, he didn't find them. They were engaged in what was soon to become known as the Battle of the Coral Sea. With his squadron now scattered, Jackson refueled and headed south to Australia and to his favorite watering hole, Hyde's Hotel in Cairns.
Later that evening, he was joined by the squadron doctor, Doc Dean Butcher, who had flown out as tail gunner in an American aircraft. The squadron doctor and the squadron commander met on this veranda. For them, the defense of Port Moresby was over. What did you say to him when you saw him? Or what did he say to you?
I think he said, hello, you old bastard, what are you doing here? something to that effect. Anyway, it was quite an emotional greeting. It was a long day.
At the end of its epic defence of Moresby, 75 Squadron had lost half its pilots and was down to its last plane. But it had destroyed 4 times as many enemy aircraft, put heart into the ground troops, a heart they were soon to show at Kokoda, and delayed the invasion for just long enough for the American fleet to turn the tide in the battles of the Coral Sea and Midway. What is more, they'd created a legend that's still spoken of today.
In March, 75 fighter squadron was formed, and barely a fortnight later, it found itself in furious action. In the space of 6 hectic weeks, it accounted for 86 enemy aircraft, to the loss of 22 of its own and 12 pilots.
The Duke of Edinburgh's tribute to 75 Squadron came at a special parade at Williamtown Fighter Base to commemorate the 50th anniversary of its foundation. Above the pomp and circumstance, a deafening flyover of FA-18 fighters, the squadron's current descendants of those first few Kittyhawks. "50 years after the mud, the dysentery and the danger of Moresby, the veterans seem somehow ill at ease chatting with royalty. Freshly ironed shirts and campaign medals are a long way from that crude strip at 7 Mile and those daily confrontations with Japanese Zeros.
I can say that, you know, both of us, both sides, we all did well, didn't we? We'd like to pat them on the back and sort of say, we really fought well. I would like to say that you guys were really brave and courageous, and I really respect you for that.
Despite their losses, 12 pilots and 30 planes in those first 44 days, the squadron rested and reformed. Bolstered by Australian Spitfire veterans from Britain and led by Les Jackson, 75 Squadron returned to New Guinea and played a decisive role in the Allied victory at Milne Bay later in 1942. From there, they pressed on to the Solomons and remained at the forefront of the air war until the last Japanese were driven from the South Pacific.
There is nothing in Australian war history quite like the achievement of John Jackson and his young pilots, ordinary Australians from all walks of life, who joined that tumult in the clouds over Port Moresby in March and April 1942. They were fighting for their families, for their friends, for their lost brothers. And for the first time, and it was the most crucial time, they more or less won.
We had no parent. In fact, it was a comparatively undisciplined group of people, well led by people we respected. There was no glory in what we were doing, but there was a lot of determination.
We were fighting as individuals. There were too few of us, there were too many of them. When you were fighting, you fought yourself. And so you only get teams when people are trained and when they're victorious and when there's more of them than there are of you. Other than that, you fight desperately alone.
I was afraid of the unknown, afraid of the beginnings of the thing, the adrenaline pumping to get started, to get up. And then once we got up, afraid that they're behind you, you can't see them. Imagination plays a great part in scaring you, anybody. If you're scared of the unknown, you're scared.
I was proud to be part of the action, and my effort was just like anybody else's effort was infinitesimal, but it was the thought and everybody being and pulling together made it what it was, I'd say.
We're all just delighted to get to the war, and I think that we all felt that we had little possibility of surviving, and I never thought I'd see the war out, but then I don't think that anybody that goes to war in these conditions, if once you start thinking about survival, I think your efficiency tends to become impaired. You've got to be a very strong mind to be able to think, well, I'm going to get back all right, and still put in, I think.
I was absolutely more than buggered. I've never been so scared. And I thought I'd been knocking right on the door of not St. Peter, somebody down below maybe. That was a bit much for me, I thought.
We were doing the same job and we took the same risks and we fought as one.